All right. Hey y'all, it's Becky here from the Beccasphere, where we talk about climate news and solutions. If you want to stay up to date with the latest information relating to the climate crisis, I highly suggest you hit that subscribe button below. Today, I'm going to break down the movie Don't Look Up from a climate crisis perspective. Don't Look Up is a Netflix original directed by Adam McKay. It has celebrities including Leonardo DiCaprio, Jennifer Lawrence, Meryl Streep, Timothée Chalamet, Jonah Hill, Ariana Grande, and Kid Cudi, because who doesn't want Ariana Grande and Kid Cudi in a movie? And the movie is about two lower-level astronomers from Michigan State named Randall Mindy and Kate Dibiowski, I will butcher that, who discover a planet-killing comet going to hit the Earth in about 6 months and 14 days. So when they tell the president, played by Meryl Streep, and her chief of staff, Jonah Hill, they are not taken seriously. Then they try to go to the media and they're still not taken seriously. All this while the asteroid is getting closer. Then Peter from Bash Cellular tells the president that he can create asteroid-destroying devices, but that humanity should wait until the last second to collect precious metal found on the comet. So they begin waiting until the last minute. Adam blatantly says that he was inspired by the climate crisis in action. In fact, he actually wrote the script before the pandemic existed, so it blew his mind how accurate the script ended up being for the public's response to that scientific issue. Another fun coincidence is that the movie came out just weeks after NASA announced its Double Asteroid Redirection Test, or DART, to test if colliding a satellite with a planet-killing sized asteroid to divert it off course enough to save a planet would actually work. So that proves that in reality, if this was the problem we were dealing with, we would have solved the problem. But bottom line, Don't Look Up is meant to be a commentary on how the US and other top emitting nations have failed to deal with the planet-killing situation, namely climate change, and how ridiculous the inaction is. So if you haven't watched it yet, I highly recommend that you do so, because now we are going to dive into my analysis. Spoiler alert, if you are still here by the time I grab a drink, then we're going to dive in. Are you still here? Okay, great. Let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so basically I'm going to split up this video in different groups of people that are being represented in the film. The first one we're going to talk about is the scientists. There are basically 3 scientists in the movie. There's Randall, who is an astronomy professor at Michigan State, played by Leo. There's Kate, who's Randall's PhD student and discovers the comet, which then gets named Comet Dibiowski, and Kate's played by Jennifer Lawrence. And then there's Teddy, who is the head of NASA's Planetary Defense Coordination Office, which is a real thing, as clarified in the movie, and he's played by Rob Morgan. We're mainly going to talk about Randall and Kate, honestly, because they're the ones that have the most commentary attached to them, I think. Randall was originally the example of a scientist who has been in his lab for too long. He's quiet and rambly, he's too technical and detailed, and he doesn't get to the point. When he first announced this finding to Teddy, he immediately downplayed his credentials by saying that he's from Michigan State and hasn't been published in a while. This says 2 things about science off the bat. First, that scientists often experience imposter syndrome even when they are experts in the field. The beauty of science is knowing that there's still plenty to learn, and this can cause scientists to sometimes underestimate themselves. Second, it shows that there's stigmas involved in what school you attend or teach. We have such an affinity towards Ivy League schools that we can underestimate how good the education system is in state schools. And every school leads in some fields, so it's ridiculous to dismiss findings coming out of a state school, but Randall's concern about him coming from Michigan State is later validated when, in the movie, Jonah Hill's character, Justin, who's the chief of staff, diminishes Randall and Kate's findings because they're from a state school, saying, well, we'll have our scientists from Cornell and Harvard look at it. Though that was something that Randall and Kate welcomed because they actually value peer review process. The peer review process is what makes science science. It's when different scientists in the profession, peers basically, replicate the process to see if they end up with the same result. This constant need to check again is why science is constantly evolving and improving. The whole premise of Don't Look Up could be summarized into what happens when something isn't peer-reviewed, because Bash Cellular's solution wasn't peer-reviewed at all, and shocker, it didn't work. For some reason, the White House insisted on Kate and Randall getting their results peer-reviewed by over 100 scientists before they believed in the conclusion, but Peter could spitfire an idea without peer review and it would be believed off the bat. The power of money. More on that later, but let's go into Kate in the beginning of the movie. Kate is kind of the alternative millennial looking scientist. We love a stoner astronomer. And when she discovers Comet Dibiowski is going to hit the Earth, she quickly internalizes this information and becomes easily emotional. While I argue that she represents what scientists are thinking throughout the movie, her saying those thoughts out loud quickly puts her in hot water with the government and soon with the media. When the scientists finally get 20 minutes with the president, both Kate and Randall show a lack of science communications experience, but in opposite ways. Randall is quiet, rambly, and starts explaining the science and math on how they found the result, eventually boring President Orlean and the chief of staff.
I just feel like this isn't what I do, you know?
You're just telling a story. Keep it simple. No math.
But it's all math.
Kate steps in to provide a blunt summary of the situation, to which the president asks how sure are they? And this was interesting because originally Randall said 100% and she said, well, there's nothing that's 100%. And then he corrects himself to say that it's actually 99.73% likelihood. And then President Orlean latches on to that last little 0.3%. And this is very relatable to the climate crisis, because even though 99.9% of scientists say that climate change is happening and man-made, people try to utilize that last 0.01% to say that it's not a done deal. Scientists generally scare away from using absolute terms because they live in nuance, but when they do, non-scientists dismiss their arguments because they're not absolute. And yet if they do use absolute terms, they're considered hysterical, so it's kind of shows the lose-lose situation that we're in. Now let's talk about the scientists' interactions with the media, specifically the talk show hosts. Randall tries to play it cool even though the hosts keep saying lighten up, but Kate quickly loses it. Instantly, her opinions are dismissed when she does so. It's really hard for scientists to be impartial to an issue that they understand is so dire, and it's a weird conflict around being relatable but not emotional. If you are just stating the facts, you're not engaging, but if you try to yell or cry about the issue, you're crazy. Kate's authority was basically gone by that point. This is especially frustrating because Randall and Kate saw the comet with their own eyes, which they talk more about later. So it's like being gaslit by the whole show when they're not believed. Climate scientists who have studied the atmosphere in ice cores and looked at growth differences in coral reefs have literally seen climate change. So I'd imagine being undermined would get exhausting really quick. And then there's the part where Kate gets silenced by the government. And this reminds me a lot of when climate scientists began quitting or being fired in mass around 2017. Soon after that administration moved in, the White House climate change webpage was removed, and scientists were no longer allowed to publish reports using phrases like climate change or global warming. When the government dismisses science, science becomes politicized, which is something that we've seen for decades in the climate crisis and something we're seeing now in the pandemic, and something that is very clear in the movie. But I'll talk more about that later when we get to the politics section. Meanwhile, Randall became more consumed by the media. He began losing his relationship with his family because he was so obsessed with picking fights on Twitter and going on talk shows. And eventually he began having an affair with one of the talk show hosts, so he was literally in bed with the media. He also became a talking head for the White House's solution after being razzle-dazzled by the fancy Bash plan. Teddy and Kate, who weren't invited to the presentation, were quickly skeptical of the plan because it had no peer review to back it up, but Randall let himself be convinced. It took scientists being fired for speaking out against the plan for him to realize that he picked the wrong side. But as soon as he lost it on live TV, the same way Kate did, he was dumped by the host and the media altogether. It only takes one small step to get fully canceled, which does not help when you have a larger than person cause that you're fighting for. And it took the comet finally being visible to the naked eye for scientists to be believed again. Many scientists have hoped that extreme weather events that have already started showing their ugly head would be that for people, would basically be the comet for people. But so far that hasn't worked. So I kind of think that mass sea level rise caused by the Thwaites Glacier melting in 3 to 5 years might unfortunately do the trick, but we'll see. Because even after the comet was visible, the politicization of the issue blinded half the population from recognizing its existence. Which brings me to the politicians. President Orlean is an example of a bad elected official. The first thing we learn about her, besides the fact that she sidelined the scientists so clearly she doesn't value their importance, is that she surrounds herself with yes men like her son Jason. He's the one that is the chief of staff, so nepotism for the win. And the head of NASA, Dr. Clancy, who is a super donor and not even qualified for her job. Like, she's an anesthesiologist. What does that have to do with space besides the fact that anesthesia makes you feel like you're floating before it knocks you out? Really funny. I don't think we've had someone quite that far off for our NASA head, but maybe I'm missing something. Actually, you know what that reminds me of now that I think of it? That's the equivalent of a fossil fuel sympathizer becoming the head of the EPA, like was the case starting in like 2016. So there it is. We found it, and that's actually worse than just being not relevant to the job. Editing Becky here. I just wanted to say that I completely forgot to talk about the sit tight and assess quote, like literally one of the most iconic quotes of the movie. You know, basically that's a good example of governments constantly telling climate scientists, not yet, not yet. We have to think about it more. We might not have the right technology, you know, all that kind of stuff. So it's a pretty obvious one. But yeah, sit tight and assess is definitely something that climate scientists have heard for a long time. President Orlean cares more about poll numbers than humanity to the extent that she will start silencing the scientists. She only starts caring about the issue when it's revealed that she's sleeping with the Supreme Court nominee who's being accused of soft porn and gross things. Then she uses the problem as a way to distract the media and paint herself as a hero. So it's always just political for her. But when she does actually take it seriously, she quickly starts taking shortcuts and unnecessary risk to maintain the status quo for as long as possible. She doesn't care that Bash's technology isn't backed up by science, as long as there's a chance that she can get her super donors rich from comet minerals. And what's the harm in taking risks when you're not the one that has to pay the consequences? I'm really curious where in the movie Peter and POTUS start planning their getaway. Let me know what you think in the comments below when you think in the timeline of the movie they started planning that. I kind of think they started planning it as soon as Peter first pitched the idea. Her need to focus on poll numbers and super donors' opinions over the health of humanity is holding up a direct mirror to how politicians have sidelined the climate crisis for decades. They use environmental talking points to get elected or re-elected, and then they spend all of their time in office making excuses as to why they can't actually deal with the issue head on yet. I don't want to lose the midterms. I have to focus on my nominee fight. All while their super donors, often fossil fuel and petrochemical companies, whisper in their ear. And this is happening on both sides of the aisle, like now. It's happened for decades and it's still happening. Right now, West Virginia Senator Joe Manchin is blocking the Build Back Better Act because it will hurt his family's coal investments. It doesn't matter that West Virginia might have benefited the most out of any state from the investments in that act. Manchin's not the one going down into the mines and getting black lung from it. He doesn't live next to air pollution, and when climate change gets worse, he has the money to pick up and move or to adjust as needed. And there's so many other examples of people in offices of power right now who are taking this selfish route. I just chose Manchin because he's kind of the thorn in the side of the collective US climate movement right now. And again, President Orlean's denial of the science is the reason why science became political at all. When it got out that money could be made if Bash's mission was successful, the issue became believing in science versus job growth, which is ridiculous because without the world existing, how are you going to have job growth? And that's true with climate change too. Here we are constantly making an excuse that clean energy transition will lose jobs, when in reality, if we don't change the way that we're treating the planet, the economy will tank anyway. Also, the clean energy transition will and already is making way more US-based jobs than fossil fuels do, and you don't have to compromise your health or local environment while doing it. But I digress. President Orlean played into the debate by creating a whole rally with hats, looks familiar, around the idea of not looking up at a comet that was by that point visible to the naked eye. And all of her followers blindly followed what she said, even as her idiot son basically bashed them for being blue-collar workers. I'm scared to think that this will be what our nation devolves into after sea level rise engulfs Louisiana and the Florida Keys. And if that happens, we are screwed. There's still time, as Riley Bina beautifully put it.
Get your head out of your ass. Listen to the goddamn qualified scientists.
And that brings me to the celebrities. By the way, at the end of the song, that whole thing, Ari straight out says, "Turn off the shit Fox News."
Turn off the shit Fox News.
That's just pure gold. So the main part of Riley Bina, played by Ari, and DJ Cello, played by Kid Cudi, was to be an example of how easily the media and people in general get distracted by celebrity drama. Before Randall and Kate get to the talk show, the hosts bring on Riley to talk about her album release, but really they want to talk about her public breakup with DJ Cello. Next thing you know, the two make up and Cello asks Riley to marry him on live television, and instantly any chance the scientists had to get the word out went out the window before they even were able to get on screen, because the news cycle was obsessed with engagement and the engagement. Even the scientists themselves were invested in that drama. Later in the movie, when the Just Look Up campaign hosts one final concert to encourage other leaders to send their own rockets into space, the audience still doesn't care about what the scientists have to say. They only are there for Riley and Chel's performance. And I think that has something really interesting to be said about celebrity activism. In my opinion, there's nothing inherently wrong with celebrities wanting to draw attention to important issues, and many stars like Leonardo DiCaprio, Mark Ruffalo, Camila Cabello, and Shawn Mendes, rest in peace that relationship, Coldplay and Jack Johnson, those are just some of the ones that came to my mind, have spoken out about the climate crisis, and I'm sure that that has increased the number of people who care about the issue. The problem is when their presence distracts from the actual issue and also outshines the voices of experts and activists who are at the front lines of the issue. A good example of this is COP26, the largest international climate conference since the Paris Climate Accord that took place just in November. I did a video on that, so if you haven't heard of it, please check it out. Basically, Leo got into the conference, no problem. Sorry, I'm gonna be burping now because I've had the drink. But Leo got into the conference no problem, but meanwhile indigenous groups, climate youth activists, and other experts could not get into the conference. So that really shows priorities. You know what also distracts the people from an important issue? Technology. And that brings me into the businessman. Some might argue that Peter from Bash Cellular is meant to represent a particular person or couple people, But to me, he actually represents several different things. So for starters, I think that Bash Cellular's phone represents how technology gives us an escape from worrying about bigger problems in the world. The introduction to Bash was a phone presentation that showed the phone being able to sense people's moods and provide cute animal videos when the person is stressed. Technology and media is being designed better and better to grab our attention and keep it for longer. But that can cause us to miss things going on in the real world, like climate change or an asteroid destroying the world. Peter himself projects that false narrative that we can solve the problem with unproven technology without having to change the way that we do things at all. And while this is a very appealing idea, it's not realistic. Case in point at the end of the movie. But like the politicians, he doesn't care because he has an escape plan anyways. By the way, did you notice at the end of the movie who were in those cryo chambers? Yeah, there was one person representing big money, another person representing big oil, and another person representing big lobbying. That's very telling. Speaking of big oil, in this way, he reminds me of fossil fuel companies because he donates a lot of money to politicians to get himself in the room at important moments. And then he tries to fix his own environmental disasters by trying to get the minerals from the comet because he's depleting the minerals on Earth. And then he provides a solution that can be applied last minute to allow him to keep going on as business as usual. Fossil fuel companies' version of that technology includes like carbon capture technology, geoengineering, and greenwashing natural gas and blue hydrogen. In reality, most of that technology either hasn't been proven to work on the scale necessary or it isn't safe or as helpful as advertised. That's not to say that all technology is bad. Actually, the vast majority of the technology that we need to solve climate change is already in the consumer phase. We just need to utilize it and recognize that it's not just our technology, but our constant need for economic growth that needs to change. Because we can't expect to escape to Mars or other parts of space before climate change wrecks our economic system, like some billionaires have dreamed of doing. I think that space travel is cool and all, but the only way we can further evolve our species into space level is to tackle our problems at home first, which means that we need to talk about them. And that leads me into the most personal section for me, the media. So if you didn't know, I have a background in environmental journalism. Well, yes, environmental science and journalism. So this part's interesting, especially to me. So there were two main examples of the media presented in the movie. Well, I guess three if you count the shitty clout-chasing boyfriend of Kate, who I think represents tabloids that you see when you're checking out at the grocery store. In the case of Don't Look Up, both examples of the media do a bad job of helping scientists relay the gravity of their news, and that is sadly pretty accurate to how climate change has been treated up until very recently. The New York Herald, which is meant to represent traditional written journalism, starts off well by being interested in the story and double checking the validity of the information with an independent scientist. But that's where it all starts going downhill because they quickly start treating their scientists as objects by telling them to get media training and arguing with themselves like Kate and Randall aren't even in the room. The objectification continues behind the scenes of the talk show as stylists tell Kate and Randall to change outfits and even change Randall's beard. Their appearance matters more than the information that they are telling people. Journalists are taught to humanize a story, and in order to do so, the people in the story have to be palatable to the public. But this doesn't work well when it comes to science stories because that could sometimes attach an idea like a planet-killing event to an individual like Kate and Randall. So if one of them, like Kate, doesn't perform or connect well enough to the public, the idea gets dismissed, which is really problematic when the idea is literally whether or not the humanity will survive. It was also all too familiar to see a science subject get put at the end of a news segment because that still happens all the time with climate stories. And with a lack of scientific literacy, media members often don't ask the right questions, also portrayed by the hosts by just kind of diving into space topics and forgetting that there was a point to the story. For some reason, we journalists can cover the most depressing topics, but when it comes to planetary collapse, we go silent. And I think it's important to remember that we are human too, and no one wants to talk about a problem that big. But the media in general has moved so far away from the topic that even talk show hosts in real life barely touch it. Like, there had to be a special night around COP26 when people like Stephen Colbert and Trevor Noah mentioned the climate crisis. I get it, it's hard to make it funny, hence why Don't Look Up exists. But like, COVID's a depressing topic. The collapse of democracy is a depressing topic, and these people cover it all the time. So what makes climate change different? My hypothesis about this is that's because people don't talk about it on a regular basis. So every time someone does speak on it, there needs to be a serious element to it. It isn't in the public's vernacular enough to add humor to it, because when people do, it ends up looking like what it looked like on Don't Look Up when the talk show hosts were trying to lighten it up for the first time Kate and Randall announced their findings to the public. It looked really out of touch. You need to talk about it seriously the first several times it's brought up so that people get a general understanding about the issue and the science behind it. And then you can start adding little humor bits in there, because then it will just keep the topic in the public mind in general. The only time the scientists talk about the issue seriously at all in the whole movie is in the New York Herald article, which ends up being buried in the news cycle because 1, there was celebrity drama that covered up the topic, 2, Kate freaked out and became a meme, and 3, the White House countered their claims. And that's another thing. Why was it that when the journalists first heard the story, including the part where the president told them to sit tight and assess, and they knew that the president pretended they didn't even have a meeting, that they took it and they were happy to demonize the government? But then when the story didn't do well and the White House came out against the statement, then the editors dropped the continuation of the story. I can't honestly say why they did that past it being no longer a moneymaker anymore. This is the main part of the movie where I actually missed the whole nuance part at first because it seemed so anti-Watergate of them to do. But then I realized I need to look at it from the context of how journalists in the past have talked about climate change, and that made it way more accurate. Again, I think it has to do with a lack of scientific literacy in the newsroom. I think it's getting better now, but before, it made the journalists uncomfortable countering the head of NASA like they would if it was a political situation, you know? And knowing that the government wanted to bury the issue meant that there wouldn't be any breaking news to encourage follow-up stories. And that's another thing. Inaction isn't news, so it doesn't inspire news coverage. The journalism world is so focused on breaking news that larger systemic issues can often be forgotten in the news cycle. They basically make one cover story and then they never get talked about again. And this is something we need to think about in the journalism community. Like, what do we do when the most important stories to humanity just aren't catchy enough? I think this then goes back to how news organizations make money. If they didn't care about ratings and views so much, they wouldn't be constantly fighting over each other to produce the next exaggerated headline. And they also wouldn't mess up facts because they wouldn't have to move so fast. But let's go back to the talk show host, specifically Bree, who's played by Cate Blanchett, because she starts to have an affair with Randall, which at first, honestly, is the usual trope of a female journalist sleeping with her sources. But in this case, I think they were trying to make a point of Randall being in bed with the media, so I'll give them a pass on that. Anyways, in the middle of their affair, we learned that Bree got like 3 master's degrees and she's now been constantly around Randall. Like, obviously she believes what he's saying. But as soon as she goes back on air, she asks Randall, so is there a comet or isn't there? As if there's 2 sides of the argument. This reminds me of how for decades climate change was treated as a 50-50 issue. One climate scientist versus one climate denialist in the name of telling all sides of the story. But this is just disingenuous because it doesn't accurately show the weight of each of the sides. I remember Bill Nye did a great job illustrating the absurdity in one of his little segments.
Nye, the science guy who believes in man-made global warming. Yeah, that's right. More often than not, it's Bill Nye the Science Guy versus some dude. And when you look at the screen, it's 50-50, which is inherently misleading. If there has to be a debate about the reality of climate change, and there doesn't, then there is only one mathematically fair way to do it. Good evening. Joining me tonight, a climate change denier and, naturally, Bill Nye Science Guy. In the interest of mathematical balance, I'm going to bring out two people who agree with you, climate skeptic, and Bill Nye, I'm also going to bring out 96 other scientists. It's a little unwieldy, but this is the only way you can actually have a representative discussion.
Even though Bree knew that the comet was coming, she still played it off as if there was an unresolved issue, literally months into the issue. Objectivity, to the extent of being uninformed, doesn't help create public understanding and confidence around an issue. Finally, I want to look at a few last parts of the film and end with my final thoughts about the movie. The movie was filled with moments of nature and innocent humanity between segments. I also noticed moments of bad things for the environment, like flying a private jet, plates full of beef, and bundles of plastic water bottles with a polar bear as their logo. These scenes honestly made me feel more emotionally charged throughout the movie. To be honest, the movie overall was really hard to watch because I knew going into it what message Adam McKay was going to try to evoke. So I kept seeing those messages throughout the movie. And I kept wondering throughout the movie also if he's actually going to do it, if he's actually going to blow up the planet at the end. Because there's been a lot of movies like this that will end up with a quick last-minute fix that saves the world. But not this time. And I appreciated that because we can't just rely on things to fix themselves at the last minute in real life. Towards the beginning, when President Orlean orders the launch of the rockets, I thought, well, this isn't realistic to climate change because we haven't gone anywhere near close to launching rockets at our metaphorical issue. But then when the rockets were turned around for monetary gain, that matched perfectly with, with what's happened with the climate crisis. And I think the most impactful scene in the movie for me was when the comet first hits and you can see an indigenous man ceremoniously dancing with a drum overlooking balls of fire falling into the forest. That one I literally started crying on because I can't help but think that that's exactly how indigenous people, hell, that's what environmentalists feel watching the Amazon burn, watching the earth change out from underneath us. It's honestly heart-wrenching, and I finished the movie overall with my head in my hands, emotionally drained, not even able to laugh at the part where the president gets eaten by a bird creature on another planet. I don't think I'll watch the movie again because it's just a lot for me, but I thought the movie was really well done. Going forward, I think more directors playing with this idea of putting climate commentary into their work would be great. If a film is set in the future, there's basically no excuse not to talk about climate change. But also, I would love to see some portrayals of what future could look like. I want to see some movies in like solar punk setting, which if you don't know, check it out. Or worlds not based on overconsumption. Like, let's dream bigger. Let's see some aspiration. And that is my analysis of Don't Look Up. Again, all of this is my opinion, but let me know what yours is in the comment section below. I would really love to know. And I enjoyed the film, but it was a lot. Shaking just thinking about it. Anyways, remember to talk about the climate crisis every single day, because if we can't talk about it, then we sure as hell can't joke about it. And be sure to support local news organizations that are doing legitimately good journalism work and are talking about the climate issue way more than they used to. So we need to encourage that. If you want to also just keep up to date with more climate news, I do climate recaps every other week. So this is the place to do it. So make sure you subscribe. And yeah, I will see you all next time. Bye. I'd like to thank the people on Patreon for their incredible support. A special shout out to the climate confident and courageous members David H., FK, Norman Anal, and Greg H. I greatly appreciate your support. If you would like to join the Beccasphere Patreon community, there's a link in the description below where you can check that out. Or if you would like to do a one-time donation, you can click the Buy a Cup of Coffee link.